Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Dianeem from the Research and Scholarship Collaborative. Thank you for joining us. We are happy to welcome today Professor Remington Harris with us. Um, I will introduce him in just a moment, but I want to let you know that we have started to award continuing education certificates. So what I will do is towards the end of the presentation, I will post a link which you can fill out, and I will then send you your certificate if you so desire. Um, I am very excited for this presentation today. I find this topic fascinating, the psychology of Vincent van Gogh. And Remington Harris is a professor at Keiser University in the Department of Psychology. Um, he is not teaching with us at the moment because he has recently relocated to Chicago, where he is completing his doctoral training in clinical psychology. He is very close to completing this. His dissertation defense is scheduled for next month, and he is currently completing his clinical hours at the Dooley Health and Care and the Will County Health Department. He is a U.S. Army veteran and practicing clinician. Mr. Harris brings expertise in clinical psychology and behavioral health to both his teaching and research. His scholarly interests include patient engagement in psychotherapy and the psychological dimensions of creativity and mental illness. And with that, I will turn this over to Professor Remington Harris. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for everybody joining me at this hour. All right, so this presentation is on the psychology of Vincent van Gogh, and there's a couple of reasons why I was drawn to this research, and I believe I'll continue to do this research over the course of the next couple of years on a project that I'm working on. But the first reason I think looking at the psychological profile of historical figures is one, it's for selfish reasons. It's good practice for me to engage in the differential diagnosis process. It's a process that all psychologists are expected to sort of be masters on or experts in when patients come to them and they say, I don't know what is really going on with me, but they have certain complaints about mood or other psychological phenomena. It's up to us to kind of help them figure this out. So by the end of this exercise, too, the second reason I'll kind of reveal, but I think it's just good practice. Having said that, I think it's also important to reiterate that psychologists should not diagnose people that they've never met. This is sort of an exercise, again, to practice the differential diagnosis process, and you might see it in some pop psychology magazines or reading material out there, but these are not intended to formally diagnose a person that we did not meet. Obviously, we can't diagnose Vincent van Gogh since he died in 1890, but because I'm sort of an art fan and a fan of Vincent van Gogh, I thought, why not practice on him? I think it's also important to sort of emphasize how psychological constructs evolve. And the psychological constructs of today that we use in the current Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders, these constructs just simply were not around in Vincent's day. Alcohol use disorder, for example, the construct that we've sort of created for ourselves to formulate treatment plans for alcohol use disorder has just undergone changes in the last 10 years. We used to think of alcohol use disorder as two separate things. On one hand, there could be alcohol abuse disorder, and on the other hand, there could be an alcohol dependency diagnosis. That's no longer the case. And that construct has evolved, like I said, just in the last 10 years. So I'm saying all this because psychology is a science, and good science or scientists will always be skeptical of evidence. They will always be skeptical of variables or results that are produced in scientific research. And it's also, as an inspiring scientist, to also be skeptical of my own thoughts, and to always be engaged in critical thinking. I think over time, some psychologists will have sort of this clinical drift. They'll drift towards their favorite diagnosis and sort of see and project this diagnosis on all their patients. And that could be very harmful to the patient. So I think it's also important to understand that even as I'm presenting my sort of results from this process, to always sort of keep an open mind and be skeptical of my own conclusions, and maybe that I missed something. And if there's anybody that would like to bring anything up that maybe, looking at it from a different perspective, I would always welcome those comments, because I think good collaboration like this is what researchers, scholars, scientists, and people just who would like to be involved in the critical thinking process should do. And just one last point on this, just 46 years ago, in our sort of the Psychology Bible and the DSM-3 that was published in 1980, homosexuality was looked upon as a mental disorder that required treatment from psychologists and medical doctors. So again, that was just 46 years ago, a couple of years before I was born, but really sort of in the grand scheme of things, sort of a blink of an eye ago. All right. So, excuse me, when anybody goes to a psychologist or a mental health professional, these are some common clinical questions that you might receive from a psychologist during the first clinical intake. The first question might be, what brings you in today? And then your answer can give a lot of really relevant clinical data to psychologists. They might develop theories in your first response, theories about your mood, theories about all sorts of things, relationship issues, and whatnot. So while we cannot ask Vincent today, questions, we can look at his writings. He wrote extensive letters. We have thousands of letters that he wrote to his younger brother, Theo, where he talked about himself, his mood, his malnutrition, his romantic relationships, work history, and his mindset at the time. So a lot of that is sort of the best we can do as sort of, an amateur psychohistorian, is just to look at what Vincent wrote himself during his lifetime. So this is a way, and this is not just my way. I think this is from guidance from the DSM. If you look at almost every psychological disorder in the DSM, criterion C or D, criteria at the bottom of the list, is just a good reminder to all psychologists to make sure that you're not adding another psychological condition on top of a presenting medical issue, or if the patient is sort of in the midst of fighting with substances. If there's substances in the person's system at the time that you're interviewing them, then you're kind of jumping the gun and even being sort of reckless, in my view, if you add on top of that, say, add on top of alcohol use disorder, sort of a personality disorder or a mood disorder such as depression or something like that. You really can't do that and add that psychological diagnosis until the substance use is treated. Same thing with medical history. You can't really add on top of a medical diagnosis all the time a psychological diagnosis. And although these specialties in medicine and psychology are very divided, they are all very much related. And I'll give you one quick example. If somebody comes in and they have a medical diagnosis that's related to cirrhosis of the liver from years of alcohol abuse, and they have no prior history of hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, for example, but they just are now experiencing auditory hallucinations, say in their 60s, they probably don't have schizophrenia. I think that in that case, any psychologist would tell you we need to make sure that we get rid of these toxins that's in your bloodstream. Ammonia, for example, can cross the blood-brain barrier, and really the toxins in your brain can really affect your thought content, and it can really contribute to delusions. I've had one patient who talked to me about the FBI conducting surveillance on him. Now, while it was possible, that the FBI was conducting surveillance on him, it was more probable that he must have had some sort of toxic sort of impact on his brain because of his liver was not processing the toxins like a healthy liver would. All right, so getting into the sort of early childhood experiences of Vincent van Gogh. This was a painting of Anna van Gogh. This was Vincent's mother. Just to make a quick comment on the painting, in the painting you can see thickness of the paint being applied. This technique is referred to as impasto, and it also gives the painting sort of a three-dimensional look. You can actually see the clumps and the ridges of the dry paint in this work and also in Van Gogh's later work. So going back to Vincent's mother, and I personally do not identify as a Freudian follower. I'm not a follower of Sigmund Freud, but I think there is something that Freud was onto and definitely salient to the development of Van Gogh's psyche. And it had implications.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are not able to see the painting.
Oh, I'm sorry. How about now?
No, we are still on the
Still
differential
nothing?
diagnosis slide.
Okay. Got that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Let me troubleshoot this real quick.
Mm-hmm. It was working earlier.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Now we see more.
All right, one more time here.
Okay. We can see it.
Okay. You see the slide?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks for bringing that to my attention.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So here you can see the sort of the clumps and the impasto applications, the technique that Vincent used in this work and later works. He didn't do this initially in his techniques, but again, you can see this sort of three-dimensional sort of impact that it has with the clumps. So going back to Freud, and he used something called psychoanalysis, and his theoretical orientation would be psychodynamic. And again, my theoretical orientation is not a psychodynamic one, but I think Freudian sort of contributions are at play here. So having said that, Vincent van Gogh's mother first gave birth. Her firstborn son was stillborn March 30th, 1852. And he was given the name, her firstborn son was given the name Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh. Strangely enough, exactly 1 year to the day, so on March 30th, 1853, the artist that we all know today was born and given the same name, Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh. So the Vincent that we know today, he was actually the second Vincent van Gogh. And it's been said and written in numerous accounts that Vincent, the second Vincent, the Vincent that we know, would visit the gravesite of his older stillborn brother with his mother. And So just imagine it, if you will, you're a little boy, maybe 3, 4 years old, and you're going to a grave, and you're looking at a tombstone with your mother who is in mourning, and you're looking at the tombstone, and your name is written on there, Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh. And you're looking up at your mother, and she's, inconsolable. She's crying, say her, I can imagine her, crying in her eyes, and young Vincent looking up at his mother, the woman that brought him into the world. And I'd be interested if anybody has any sort of personal ideas about this. What to the question, what sort of emotional response would Van Gogh sort of experience in that sort of scene? What kind of schemas or ideas about himself and his mother, or even others, and the whole world? What sort of thoughts do you think that would pop up in a young boy's mind at that time? So I threw those a lot of questions at you. I threw at you, but just something to think about. And if anybody has any responses, you can put them in the chat, or we can talk about it at the end of the presentation. Um, but I think this this relationship, this attachment that he had to his mother, I can see from a Freudian perspective. Sigmund Freud, if he was here today, might say that this impacted his future romantic relationships because, as we'll talk about later on in the presentation, Van Gogh was attracted to women who were either grieving or socially marginalized, widows, sex workers, women who were marked by loss. These are the women and the situation that they were in. These are the women that he pursued. So either he was attracted to these women, or he was either putting himself in a familiar role of counselor or a consoler, of somebody who enjoyed women being dependent on him for emotional support. It was what he knew, is what I'm getting at, and he was very familiar in this role. So it's no wonder in his romantic relationships as an adult, he also sort of uh, occupied this very familiar role of consoler. This was Vincent van Gogh's father. He was a pastor in a small Dutch Reformed church in Holland. In 1864, at the age of 11, Vincent van Gogh was sent away to boarding school. Um, he described to his friends and others feelings of being abandoned um, by. And Dr. Shoshana, are you seeing Van Gogh's father now, or are you still seeing the mother?
No, still seeing the same slide.
Okay. That's weird. It's getting stuck for some reason when I'm sharing the screen.
Hmm.
All right.
There we go.
What is okay, you can see the father now. Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Good. All right. Vincent van Gogh's father sent him to boarding school. Vincent felt that he was abandoned. Um, and on Christmas Day in 1881, his father finally asked him to move out. He was living at the family house too long, and they had a big fight, and he left. And that was a significant emotional event for Vincent. Not only did he feel abandoned by his father and leave the house, but he also lost faith in the church as well. Still showing us stuck. Dr. Shoshana, I was wondering if you
Yes.
were
You want me
able
to
to
upload?
share. Yeah, if you could. I think this is going to be a repeat problem here.
Hang on one second. trying to get that for you.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through the slides now, and it's still showing us stuck.
Okay, are you able to go into the next one while I'm trying to pull this up?
Yeah, let me see here.
Yeah, I'm also having problems getting the slides.
Okay. This slide here, you see Theo Van Gogh. This was Vincent's younger brother, and sadly, sort of the only source of love and support in Vincent's short life. Theo Van Gogh was an art dealer with some prominence. He had a firm that he was working with in Paris, and he routinely negotiated with a very well-known artists of the time, including Paul Gauguin. And he actually asked Gauguin to go live with his older brother Vincent in Arles in exchange for some monetary benefits, which we'll talk about here shortly. This is Vincent van Gogh's first cousin, and also one of his romantic pursuits. Her name was Keiser Stricker. She was a widow, and Vincent pursued her romantically. She said no, never, never. And Vincent was he was a boundary crosser, and he was very intense in his personality. And in one incident, he went to the house where Key was hiding in a closet, and her family was helping her hide from Vincent. Vincent reportedly held his hand over a flame of a burning candle and said, let me see her as long as I can hold my hand over this flame. And apparently, this gesture in Van Gogh's mind was meant to prove his endurance, his devotion, and his suffering, as if this emotional truth could be validated through physical pain. Ultimately, the family members of Key intervened and they extinguished the candle. But this is just one incident where Van Gogh was sort of, engaging really in self-injurious behavior as sort of proof for his love of his first cousin, who was a widow, that he thought that he could sort of fill the void, maybe in the same way that he believed himself to fill the void with his mother as the void of the first Vincent that she was mourning.
I have to apologize. I'm not able to open up your PowerPoint. It's
Okay, it's okay.
not sending me the verification code. So
Okay.
Microsoft is being very weird today.
Yeah, that is weird. I didn't have any problems earlier with that. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Just so you know, Microsoft is having issues everywhere today.
Okay. Lovely.
All right. This is another romantic pursuit of Vincent van Gogh. Clasina was also referred to as Scene. She was a sex worker. She was impoverished. She was pregnant with another man's child when Vincent met her, and she already had another child. So you can sort of imagine what Vincent's very conservative pastor father thought about this relationship. But Vincent actually took her in and believed that he could sort of save her, and that she would be somewhat dependent on him. Ultimately, this relationship ended as all of Vincent van Gogh's relationships ended. And he was never married, and he was but he wanted to be with a woman. He was very lonely for most of his life, and ultimately courtship he was not successful in. So this is Paul Gauguin. He was just like Vincent. He was also a post-impressionist painter. Um, with Theo, the younger brother of Vincent, begging Paul to move in with Vincent in the little yellow house in Arles, France, in exchange for a monthly stipend, paid travel expenses, living expenses at the yellow house, art supplies and materials, and sort of this professional promotion. These are all things that Theo promised Paul Gauguin, and he desperately wanted somebody to live with his older brother because he was concerned with his older brother's mental health at the time. Vincent at the time was writing Theo letters all the time, talking about how lonely he was, how his mood was really low, how malnourished and impoverished he was, how sort of down on his luck he was because he wasn't able to sell, have a painting that sold for anything of significance in monetary value. And he was really down on his luck. And his younger brother, sort of always being this loving younger brother and this sort of source of love and support, was scared and he was concerned. And he begged Paul Gauguin, who was a sort of up and coming and very prominent post impressionist painter at the time. He begged Paul to go live with Vincent, and he did. He lived with Vincent in a house that we'll talk about briefly for a short time. But while these negotiations were going on between Theo and Gauguin, it was 1888, and Vincent, like I said, he was not doing so well. He was probably drinking a lot of absinthe, which was a common alcoholic drink served at night cafes such as this one. He was not sleeping very well, often sleeping maybe 3 or 4 hours a night. Um, and he was hanging out at this place, the night cafe. And this was a painting where you can see he used a lot of complementary colors deliberately, not for harmony, but to create an emotional response within the viewer. And that's part of what post impressionists did. They didn't just want to try to capture their scene that they were painting in an objective, realistic way. Instead, they want to invoke or elicit some sort of emotional response or passion within the viewer who is looking at the art, who is looking at the canvas. And that's the real difference between post impressionist and impressionist painters. But he used the reds and greens, for example. And a lot of people, when they look at this, will say there's sort of an intensity to this. There's an emotional intensity, there's a psychological intensity. Some people have very visceral responses when they're looking at the bright colors and looking at the lights, this sort of these bright yellows, which were sort of emanating from these lights. And yellow was something that you can see in Van Gogh's paintings, especially his later works. That was his favorite color to use, and there was a reason for that. Um, but if you're looking again at the painting, the reds and the greens are supposed to agitate the viewer. The reds we associate with danger, and the reds and the greens and the yellows in the context with the night cafe, you can see some of the folks that are sort of slumped over their tables with a lot of alcoholic drinks, probably in a state of intoxication. He attributed these sort of scenes as for people who are immoral or sort of flawed in some way. And he said that this cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. So these are probably feelings that were internal to Vincent van Gogh at the time, and he's sort of projecting this onto the canvas, and he's hoping that his viewers looking at the painting as well will also have this sort of visceral reaction or thoughts about the scene that he was sort of hanging out in this sort of bar late at night. All right. So, in addition to probably abusing absinthe, which Vincent van Gogh talked to his younger brother Theo in his letters about drinking too much, he was also licking his paintbrush. And paints at the time in the 19th century were very lead-based, and it was common um, for artists, not just Van Gogh, to shape the brushes by licking them. But unfortunately, because of the lead-based paint, they were exposing their bloodstreams to lead, which is obviously a toxin that can also affect um, patients neurologically. Lead-based anything can lead to hallucinations and seizures, among other things. And at the time, in addition to having lead in his system, drinking too much, Van Gogh was very malnourished. He was talking about losing weight, being hungry. He sort of prioritized making sure that he had painting supplies over food. Um, and he was very sleep deprived. All right, this next slide is the Yellow House, or the Studio of the South. Um, this is where Van Gogh lived, and this is where Theo was begging Paul Gauguin to move to live with Vincent. And you can again refer back to Vincent's writings and the letters that he was writing to Theo. And he talked about how this yellow house, he wanted to make it a real artist colony. He also said, here in the South, I feel that I can work more calmly, and I hope other painters will come here and settle here. He said, working alone, one risks becoming sick, whereas together one remains strong. And he also said to his brother, if Gauguin comes, then I will feel less lonely and more like myself. And he also said the house is painted yellow outside because I want it to be warm like a sun for people to come into it. So just using, Van Gogh's own words, I don't think it's a leap to um, use his words as a psychological interpretation that involves maybe some loneliness, some despair, a lack of secure attachment. And I think, sort of calling for more people to move in with him at the little yellow house was an artistic and psychological survival strategy, really, for Van Gogh. And I think at the time, because he wasn't this huge prominent artist at the time, there must have been some people that said, these are a little bit grandiose ideas, Vincent. You're not a big painter like Gauguin. Why would Gauguin move in with you? And, why are all these artists from around the world going to come in and move in with you at this house in the South? So maybe you're being a little bit grandiose. And at the time, maybe they weren't wrong. Here, we're sitting in a position from, in posterity, and we're looking back and Vincent van Gogh has a little bit of a different presentation, probably, than his contemporaries were holding in their own minds. So, so far, we've taken just a quick snapshot, a glimpse at Vincent's childhood, his relationship with his parents, his brothers, romantic relationships, all of them failed, and his friend Gauguin just a little bit. His friend Gauguin, his so-called friend, was sort of basically paid by Theo to move in. He did move in. He moved in with Van Gogh for about 9 weeks. It was a period where there's very well-known works of art that were painted by Vincent and Paul Gauguin at this time. So it was like very intense creativity, and masterpieces were made. But ultimately, Paul Gauguin, like pretty much everybody else, unfortunately, in Vincent's life, couldn't stand him, and he left. And he said, "I'm storming out, and I've had enough. I can't live with you anymore. You're too much for me." And Van Gogh, in maybe a state of hysteria, or maybe a drunken stupor, or maybe the lead poisoning, the malnourishedness, the insomnia, everything that he was dealing with, sort of culminated in the infamous ear incident where he cut off a huge portion of his left ear. And in doing this, he said later on he didn't remember it. And there was another account where he said that if he were to do this and display, again, this physical suffering, that this would somehow convince Paul Gauguin to move back in with him. To us that are sitting here, very, sober-minded, this doesn't make any sense. But in, Vincent's state that he was in, he thought that this would bring Paul Gauguin back to live with him, and they could continue their creative works of art. That was not the case. So now Paul Gauguin rejected and abandoned Vincent van Gogh as well. After the infamous ear incident, the town of Arles, France, put together a petition, and they started gathering signatures, and they no longer wanted Vincent van Gogh to live in Arles. It was just he was too much apparently for the entire community to live with. So now he was a literal outcast, and he was ostracized from the entire community. So he was put into an asylum in Saint-Remy, and this is one of the paintings that he painted. It's called the Asylum Gardens at Arles, and he painted this in 1889. And this next slide that I'm about to show you here, this was also painted at Saint-Remy. We all know this is the Starry Night. It is on display currently in New York City if you'd like to see it. And this was painted 13 months before Vincent van Gogh died. And next slide here. So in pop culture, Vincent van Gogh, it's been said to believe by pretty prominent psychologists, in fact, that Vincent van Gogh had bipolar disorder. But I would remind you again what is said explicitly in the DSM is that these mood disorders, bipolar 1 is, should not be diagnosed with, accounting to for a person if substance use or another medical condition is present. In this case, we know that with a pretty high degree of certainty that Vincent van Gogh was abusing alcohol and also licking paint, which was lead-based at the time. So until the substance abuse is treated, until the lead is cleaned out of the system, in my view, this would be sort of it would be a reckless diagnosis to place on top of Vincent van Gogh. And this is a very sort of ubiquitous and common hypothesis when speaking about Vincent van Gogh, that he had bipolar disorder. But at first glance, I can understand why some people would think that. Criteria that it's involved in bipolar disorder is a decreased need for sleep. People are more talkative, or they have pressured speaking. They have flight of ideas. They have these grandiose ideas. They have a manic episode, which they have this very expansive and maybe grandiose and elevated mood. But in fact, that mood state at that high of a level is really a risk to themselves or other people. And if they're not hospitalized, they could seriously harm themselves. So at first glance, I could see why a lot of people would suggest that Vincent van Gogh had bipolar disorder. which is a very biologically based disorder. And the first sort of line of defense or treatment in this is medication. But there's never been any sort of writings by Vincent van Gogh or anybody else in his family to suggest that he had these episodic mood, sort of elevated mood that would last for a week or longer. His mood swings seem to be actually in response to an event that occurred in his life. So, his father throwing him out, his first cousin who was a new widow rejecting his love. Paul Gauguin, who he was so excited to live with, sort of abandoned him. The community is saying, you're crazy, just leave us alone. We don't want you here. You should be in an insane asylum, along with the insomnia, the malnutrition, the licking of the paint. All these things, I think, first need to be sort of confronted and handled and cleared up before you throw a mood disorder or a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia spectrum disorders, where hallucinations are sort of criteria A. That's part of the diagnosis. Did Vincent van Gogh have hallucinations? I believe that he did, but is it because of a biologically based disorder like schizophrenia? Probably not. It's probably more due to the lack of sleep, the stress, the alcohol abuse, and the lead paint. Now, I could be wrong, but all I'm saying is that in addition to diagnosing him with alcohol use disorder, it would be a little bit of a stretch to also diagnose him with a very serious and biologically based mental health disorder like schizophrenia. So this is Dr. Gail Saltz. This is, we don't have enough time to watch the YouTube video, but there's the link if you want to check that out. She is a medical doctor by training with a specialty in psychiatry. So she is sort of a figure, I guess, in pop culture, if you will, that speculates that Vincent van Gogh had temporal lobe epilepsy. She talked about his, in the video, you'll hear her talk about his sticky personality and his intense personality and seizures. And while he may have had seizures, it is just unclear, and I think in a stretch, once again, to say that the root cause of these seizures is this underlying brain or medical condition known as temporal lobe epilepsy. We also know that absinthe and lead and lack of sleep and lack of nutrition and all these other things that still need to be cleared up can also lead to seizures. So it's just not, I think, in my view, and I'm understanding that I'm saying this from a psychological perspective, and I'm viewing Vincent van Gogh from that psychological perspective, but I just don't see the medical diagnosis of temporal lobe epilepsy as being warranted. We're just wrapping up here, but the next thing I wanted to talk about was Vincent van Gogh and death. There's even different theories as to how Vincent van Gogh died, and there's some relatively new movies with big actors that have just been released. One of them is called At Eternity's Gate, starring William Dafoe. I forgot what year it came out, but it's relatively new. I think it came out in 2018. But William Dafoe, if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it. I'm a big fan of William Dafoe, and I think that he did great justice and service to the portrayal of Vincent van Gogh. And it takes the movie is really takes on the artistic approach to Van Gogh in his final years, and it presents a very dramatic alternative to the suicide theory, which I would say is the prominent sort of the conventional wisdom that Vincent van Gogh did take his own life by gunshot. But this is an idea, this movie, and in pop culture, there's a murder theory out there that's popularized by a biography by Stephen Naya, Stephen Neffe, and Gregory White Smith. And if you want to check it out, the book is called Van Gogh, The Life. And in that, the artist suggests that two teenage boys or adolescent boys actually killed Vincent van Gogh with a gun on accident, and he did not kill himself. But I obviously have a different take. I think that's probably not likely that occurred. An older movie in 1956 starring Kirk Douglas called Lust for Life. Kirk Douglas here is portraying one of the last pieces of art that Van Gogh painted, called Wheat Field with Crows. And, in this picture, some have suggested that sort of Van Gogh is sort of projecting his own suicide that's going to happen in the future. And these crows that are flying above the wheat field are all flying sort of in unison, and maybe sort of flew up from the wheat field, suggesting they were disturbed by something. And this disturbance, some float the idea that it could be a gunshot. And this was potentially Van Gogh's last painting that he ever painted. But there is some speculation involving that. All right. This is a gun that was found in the 1960s by a farmer in France, and it was sold at an auction for about 182,000. That's US dollars. And it's not even confirmed if this is the gun that Vincent van Gogh used to end his life, but it is speculated that this could be. And it just goes to show you the sort of the folklore around this iconic character is real. People are paying big bucks for artifacts. Has anything to do with Vincent van Gogh. All right, we just got a few minutes. So in the interest of time, I'll just jump forward to what I think Vincent van Gogh was dealing with at the time. My diagnosis for Vincent van Gogh today, if you were here today, would be borderline personality disorder, which I can talk more about if there's any questions on that. Alcohol use disorder, and insomnia. Those would be my three diagnoses of Van Gogh. And so what does that mean? Or what is that, what's the so what? Or why even go through, again, this differential diagnosis process if he did have borderline personality disorder or alcohol use disorder or insomnia? There's a lot of stigma around borderline personality disorder in particular. But I wanted to sort of, and schizophrenia, for example, is another one where there's a lot of stigma. But there's a slide here, and I hope that you see the one that I'm seeing right now. It's actually, Shoshana, could you tell me which one you can see now on your end?
I'm seeing Marsha Linehan.
Okay. Yeah, Marsha Linehan. She also had borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is a developmental disorder that sort of is nested in a childhood that was involved a lot of trauma. People with borderline personality disorder are described as hot and cold in relationships. They idealize some people, and then, the next week they might hate them. They're also prone to substance use disorders like Vincent van Gogh was, and they're also prone to suicidal ideations. Marsha Linehan is a renowned researcher, psychologist. She developed her own empirically valid and evidence-based treatment for borderline personality, and that is called DBT, dialectic behavioral therapy. So she is very prominent and very well respected in the field of psychology, and she also had borderline personality disorder. And she had this lived experience, and I think she did something amazing by creating DBT that is used by thousands of psychologists and clinicians to treat borderline personality disorder. So even if Vincent van Gogh had borderline personality disorder, the second reason I sort of wanted to do this presentation was to bring sort of more awareness around psychological constructs such as borderline personality disorder, given the stigma of it. Vincent van Gogh, in my view, I'm pretty confident that he would meet the diagnostic criteria today for borderline personality disorder. But again, the big question is, so what? What does that mean? And I think it's important for me and for other clinicians and other doctors to not reduce individuals down to their diagnosis. Just because you have a diagnosis at one period in time doesn't mean it's a forever diagnosis. And just because you have a diagnosis doesn't mean that, people like me or other doctors or psychologists should reduce our patients down to their diagnosis. We should always remember the importance of using person first language. We should never use harmful or stigmatizing labels such as alcoholic or schizophrenic. I think it's better and more humanistic to say this is a person who's living with schizophrenia, or this is a person who's living with alcohol use disorder. So that's the sort of second reason I wanted to delve into the psychological profile of Vincent van Gogh, because I think that he was a person that was deeply troubled, and no wonder given his all of his experiences that he went through in life. Like I said, I do think that he had borderline personality disorder, but again, so what? He has really moved, including me and millions of people that have looked at his paintings, and I think he'll continue to have a positive impact on culture and future generations for millennia to come. So I think that we should also look at people for their strengths and their creative genius, and I think we all have something to offer this world, irrespective of any psychological condition. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I just posted in the chat the certificate information, and we do have some time, a few minutes for some questions. I actually have a question. I was trained before my doctorate as a dance movement therapist. So that's a degree in creative arts therapy. So we do have some exposure to art therapy. And I'm curious if you have exposure to that and how an art therapist might interpret some of Van Gogh's work.
Yeah, I love that question. I have very little experience with art therapy. I was able to sit and observe an art therapist do what I would call wonders for veterans with PTSD. Especially thinking about American culture or male culture or the strongman culture. Veterans that are men, since they're little boys, we're taught themes and receive messages that suggest that we shouldn't talk about our feelings. So verbalizing anything with emotions, you could be viewed as flawed or weak for even doing that. Some people don't want to talk about their feelings. It might be too painful for some people. But art and paints and dance and other forms of art are another form of expression. Some people that are not capable of articulating their emotions verbally. There's a condition called alexithymia where they can't verbally talk about or even identify what they're feeling internally, but they can do wonders with a paintbrush. And I think Vincent van Gogh would be another person who he did express himself verbally and with writing, but he communicated so much more, I think, profoundly and clearly with his paintbrush. So I'm a big believer in art therapy. I think it's beneficial, and I would like to actually learn more about that.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see if this has also been analyzed from their perspective.
Sure.
Are there any questions? Any other questions? I see Carmel. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I just have a statement. I thought it was really interesting what you said, Shoshana. I do think that different disciplines may have different perspectives on the issue, and I think that's why we all have to work together as a multidisciplinary team. And I think that Vincent van Gogh would have been much better off in our century, of course. But I'm speaking as a professional nurse. And of course, we don't give medical diagnoses, but what we can do is give nursing diagnosis. And as a nursing diagnosis, I would say that his personality has to do with watching his mother grieve to start. He witnessed that sympathy. He was sympathetic for his mother and his lost sibling. And I think sometimes that sympathy can transcend into empathy. And when you act upon that empathy, you can become very passionate. And to me, it seemed like his passionate was made through that art, which could have benefited him mentally. But also, I think that having all that passion can hurt people in a way too. Um, that could be, having so much passion could explain why he felt he needed to be a savior to these women to help them, because he was so passionate from the beginning and it just developed. And I can see that happening. And I think that overpassion can cause emotional pain. And I think that that's probably the story of his life. And of course, the lead poisoning and the alcohol would contribute, obviously. And in today's world, we would be testing for that and helping him. But I think, that all of that just kind of contributes to that underlining thinking of what he was thinking all the time in his mind and his mental status. So that was good. I'm proud of you, Rem. Good job.
Well, you have to say that you're my mother. Thank you for being here again.
I love that. This was great. I love this. This was fascinating. We're going to be posting this recording. I'm sure it's going to have many views. You did a great job on this presentation, and it's a truly fascinating topic. So thank you again. Thank you
No,
again
my
for
pleasure.
presenting.
Sorry for the tech difficulties. I feel like this is a whole semester that we could talk about with Van Gogh's psychology. But
Absolutely.
thanks for the opportunity.
Yes, we would love to have you back. We would love for you to, once you defend your dissertation, have you back as Dr. Harris. That would be a really nice thing. Yeah, I mean, this was really, you did great delivery, great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Again, I posted the link to the continuing education certificate if you would like to fill that out, and I will get that to you shortly. Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.